Okay, now let's talk about Excel formulas and functions. And here's where it really starts to get interesting, because Excel formulas and functions are the real power of Excel. Everything we saw before is useful, copying cells, pasting cells, formatting cells, all that is really useful. But with Excel formulas and functions is where the real power is. Here's where you can save hours and hours and hours of time by learning how to use Excel formulas and functions. And we're going to start explaining it right now. Let's start by talking a little bit about static values and dynamic values in Excel. Those are technical terms which essentially mean a value that doesn't change, which is a static value, or a value that changes, which is a dynamic or formula value. Now, a static value is, for example, if I told you the cell value is 3, and if you were calculating cell values, let's say you had a calculator in your hand right now, and you were calculating the stuff that I said, and I told you your value is always going to be 3, then the results that you would give me is simply 3. If I say, what's the result for week 1? Well, it's 3. And for week 2, the result is 3. For week 3, the result is 3, and so on, and so on, and so on. That's a static value. It doesn't change. The cell value is always equal to 3. Now, a dynamic or formula value is if I give you a mathematical formula or a recipe which tells you how to calculate the cell value based on something else. That's a formula. For example, if I told you the cell value is last week's value plus 100. See, that's a formula. That's a mathematical equation. I'm telling you, take last week's value and add 100 to it. So then, if you started off with a value of 3, next week you'd give me a result of 103, 203, 303. The previous week's value plus 100. That's your result. And see, the cell value goes changing with time, whereas the static value never changes. That's the first thing we need to understand in order to understand formulas in Excel. Static values are numbers that you just type into cells. If you look right here at the cell contents, it's simply a 3. And if we look at this one, it's a 3, and this one is a 3. When Excel finds a number that we type in a cell, it's not going to change it, it's not going to do anything to it, it's simply going to understand that it's a number and it's supposed to stay that way. So Excel doesn't touch it. Now, when Excel finds a formula, which looks something like this, then some processing goes on. Excel starts trying to understand what it is we want to do and starts interpreting this that we wrote here as a formula and according to the rules that it has for calculating formulas. So that's a formula in Excel. You can tell that a cell contains a formula because it'll either start with an equals, a minus sign, a plus sign. Those are the 3 most common formula operators. Whenever I type equals into Excel and I add something else, for example, equals 1, Excel understands that's a formula. Or I could type equals, select another cell, for example, P4 plus 5. Excel understands this is a formula. Or I could simply type plus, and that's going to indicate to Excel that I'm about to start a formula. I select the cell reference, plus 5. Now I can also create formulas with static values. I don't necessarily have to reference other cells. For example, I could change this formula to be equal to 5 plus 5 plus 5. And Excel calculates 15. It's true that this value isn't going to change. I can copy the formula to other cells and nothing's going to change, but it's still a formula in Excel. A neat little trick with this is that you can use it to remember how you calculated a value in a cell. For example, if this was the result of a week and it turns out that that week there was a 15% increase in costs, and it turns out my base cost is 100, now I could type 115 in this cell. That's all right. But then probably in 6 months, when I'm looking at this number, I'd have a hard time remembering how I got to 115 and why this number is higher than the rest. Whereas if I do something like this, equals 100 times 1.15, which indicates that I'm increasing the cost in 15%, At least then I'll know when I look at it in the future and I step into this cell, I'll say, oh, okay, this was a value of 100, which is that week's cost, multiplied by 15% because there was a 15% increase, and now I know how I got to this number. So that's a useful way to use functions and static values in Excel. You don't necessarily have to reference other cells or use functions. You can do something as simple as this. Now, what's a function in Excel? One thing is a formula, and the formula is made up of functions. Functions are operations that Excel understands, and they have names or special characters that represent them. For example, the add function, which we're all familiar with, simply adds two numbers together. And the add function is represented by a plus sign. 5 plus 5 is 10. As you can imagine, the regular old mathematical expressions are all functions: plus, minus, division, and multiplication. Now, a plus sign means to add, a minus sign means to subtract, and if you're not familiar with computer terminology, in computer terminology, you multiply with an asterisk. Okay, 10 asterisk 5 means 10 times 5. See, right there, that's what it means, 10 times 5. Now, division is represented by a slash, and that's a forward slash. Don't confuse your forward slash with a backslash. Your forward slash is this one. See, that's a forward slash, and this is a backslash. Okay, this is forward slash, and this is backslash. You're not supposed to use this one to represent division. If you try to do that, you're going to get an error. So don't use the backslash. For division, use a forward slash. So for example, if I do 50 slash 10, I need to add an equal. Remember that you always start a formula with an equal, a plus, or a minus. Then I get 5, which is 50 divided by 10. Now, an important tip is to always start your formulas with an equal sign. I said before that you can use a plus sign, and you can also use a minus sign for your formulas, but the plus sign and minus sign has mathematical implications. I see a lot of people starting formulas with a plus sign, which I consider to be a pretty bad habit. To start off your formulas, always use the equal sign. Don't use the plus sign or the minus sign, because later that can cause confusion, and you can even make a mistake and put a sign in there that's not supposed to be in there. You'll flip your number around, and it'll be a big mess that you'll have to figure out later. So first thing you should know about formulas, always start your formulas out with an equals. Now, Excel has a whole lot of other functions aside from the regular old mathematical functions, and those can be found here where it says formulas under this section which says function library. You just look at the topic that you want to cover, for example, date and time functions, logical functions, financial functions, lookup and reference, and so on, and you select the drop down. And right here, you get a list of the most common Excel functions. For example, these are logical functions, these are text functions, these are lookup and reference functions in Excel, these are math and trigonometry functions. For example, if you're wondering what other mathematical functions exist besides addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, well, all of these exist. You got logarithms, you got base 10 logarithms, you have pi, you have power of something, you have rounding functions, a whole series of math functions, and there's even trigonometry here. You have sine, cosine, arctangent, arcsine, and almost any mathematical function that you can imagine you can find here. And there's other functions that you can use, statistical, engineering, stuff like that. Excel has more functions than you could probably even imagine. So I suggest you start looking at these categories and seeing what functions are there and what they're used for. Seeing what they're used for and how they're used for is pretty easy. You just take your cursor, hover over the function name, and it'll give you a description of what it does. And in fact, if you select the function, you get some help here, which tells you what it's for, and it even tells you what values you need to enter to make the function work. Thanks for watching this video tutorial. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe to our channel and to visit our website, cubicleoverlords.com, for more instructional videos like this one.